Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's 1010 webinar, a webinar that we are organizing in cooperation with SBS and that will talk about the participation of small and medium-sized enterprises, the so-called SMEs in standardization. My name is Els, and I will, as usual, be moderating this webinar. You will see that you are all muted during the webinar. You do not have the possibility to speak out loud, but you can enter your questions in the Q&A panel of the webinar. So we kindly ask you to do so during the presentation, and afterwards the speakers can take a look at the questions and reply as many questions as possible. Should your question remain unreplied, please bear in mind that we will upload a Q&A report on our website later on. This webinar is being recorded, so you will also receive the presentation together with the recording in your inbox later today. Should you be on Twitter, you're always free, and we are happy to see that you're tweeting about the topic. We have our handle Standards for EU and a dedicated hashtag 1010webinar. So let me take a moment to introduce the speakers of today, because I have the pleasure to let you know that we have Maitane Olabaria, Director of SBS, and my colleague Deborah Wautier, who is Project Manager in the Governance and Partnerships team. So please, ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. So today's presentation will indeed be on the participation and representation of small and medium enterprises in standardization. I'll start by briefly covering the inclusiveness of the European standardization system, say a few words on the European regulation on European standardization, and then I'll focus on Sen and Senelec partnership with SBS. And then Maitane will inform you on what SBS or Small Business Standards is, what they do, and we will inform you on how SBS participates within Sen and Senelec community. And a very exciting point on today's agenda, Maitane will also present the brand new SME compatibility test that SBS has developed and published a few days ago, so that's very exciting. But first, Maitane, in a few words, can you remind us why it is important to consider SME needs in standardization?
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, so as we all know, SMEs are a key part of the European economy. They represent the majority of all the businesses in Europe. And in the EU's private sector alone, they account for 2/3 of all jobs. This basically means that the SMEs are potentially the greatest users of standards, but we know that the participation of SMEs in the standardization process is not as high as it should be if we take into account their importance within the economy. So if we look at 2019, for example, alone Sen and Senelec published more than 1,600 standards, technical specifications, and reports. We all know that there are multiple benefits in the use of standards: interoperability, access to market, reduced cost, increased quality. But if we want SMEs to actually be able to fully benefit from standards, it is important they participate in writing them and that their needs are considered in the standardization process. Otherwise, we have the risk of developing standards that only cater to the needs of big companies. So I give you now back the floor, Deborah, so that you can continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Maitane, for reminding this. Well, I just want to remind the key assets of the European standardization system, which are the diversity, the inclusivity, and the transparency of the system. We strongly believe that the more varied the participation of all sectors of society, the better and stronger the standards. Standards that reflect not only the scientific and technical state of art, but also take into consideration the concerns and priorities of the wider society, small and bigger enterprises, and ensure a fully functioning European single market. So at Sensenelec, we actively engage in involving all interested and relevant stakeholders. As I said, that include industries, SMEs, but also consumers, academia, researchers, users, environmental NGOs, the European Commission, etc., etc. Our system is based on the national delegation principle. which is an important principle I want to take a few moments to explain. That's where delegates participate in the technical bodies at European level, actually represent a national point of view that takes into account all interested parties affected by the work. So as such, SMEs, just like other stakeholders, are encouraged to engage with the national standardization organizations and to take part in the European and international standardization system via these national standardization organizations, which are members of SEN and SENELEC. Another point that I wanted to take the opportunity today to mention is, of course, that Regulation 1025 that the European Commission published in 2012 that is dedicated to European standardization. It also stresses the importance for SMEs to participate at national level, but this regulation really aims at further facilitating the inclusion of stakeholders that might have a weaker voice at national level, and thus helps complement their participation in standardization via the support at the European level from a European stakeholder organization receiving union financing. So in that regulations, there are four stakeholders that have been identified. There are three of them that represent societal stakeholders. So that is ANEC representing consumers, ETUC representing workers' interest, and ECOS representing environmental interest. And there's the fourth stakeholder, which is SBS with us today, representing SMEs' interest in the system. So yeah, as I said, this is very a complementary tool to the participation of SMEs and societal stakeholders in the national level. And those four European organizations that represent those stakeholders are mentioned in the Annex 3 of the European Commission Regulation 1025. So that's why they were referred to within the standardization community as the Annex 3 organizations. So here SBS offer an extra voice to SMEs in the European standardization system by representing their interest at the different stages of the development of European standards or other European standardization deliverables. SBS, similarly to the other Annex 3 organizations, has signed partnership agreements with both SEN and SENELEC, and hence has specific rights and obligations within the European standardization system, which are explained in our SEN and SENELEC Guide 25, defining the concept of our partnerships. As an Annex 3 organization and as a partner of SEN and of SENELEC, SBS has the right to participate as an observer at SEN and SENELEC governance level. So they can participate to the general assemblies, to the technical boards meetings, to policy discussions, etc., etc. And the second right that is provided is that they have the right to participate at technical level, of course, so in the TCs, technical committees, working groups, etc., etc., where SBS can participate in any technical committees and the relevant working groups without any restriction. So this means, for example, that SBS can have one representative joining the TC meetings as observer and can have a few experts participating in the working groups. The experts appointed by SBS will also receive all relevant documents of those technical committees or working groups that they have requested access to. And SBS, as other Annex 3 organization, also has the right to comment on all draft or final draft standards that are submitted to public inquiry or formal vote. And finally, SEN and SENELEC also have a dedicated working group for SMEs related activities of SEN and SENELEC and their members, where SBS is obviously actively participating. And here, this is just a toolbox of links that are relevant for enhancing the participation of SMEs within SEN and SENELEC work. And most of them are also examples of actions that have been jointly produced together with SBS and their own membership. One of them that I want to highlight is our Sensenelec Guide 17, sorry, which is really there to make it easier for standard writers and for SMEs to read and apply the Senselec Guide 17. And it has been published in many languages. I forgot how many, but they're all provided for free to download on Sen and Senelec website. So you can have a look at this guide, which Maitane will refer to in a second when presenting the SBS SME compatibility test. So Maitane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah. And before I go more into details about the SME compatibility test for standards, I want to say a few words about SBS for those that might not be familiar with us. So the three main goals of small business standards, SBS, are first, to represent the interest of SMEs in the standardization process, both at European and, as we know, since the standards are increasingly being developed at international level, as well at international level. Two, to raise the awareness of SMEs about the importance and benefits of standardization. And the third main goal is to try to motivate SMEs to get involved in the standardization process. So in order to achieve the goals I mentioned, SBS carries out many activities. I just will mention a few of them, which I think might be particularly relevant for you. From the technical side, one of our main activities is the appointment of SME experts to relevant technical committees and working groups at the European and international level. Currently, we have 62 experts working in more than 70 technical committees. And these include a wide range of sectors, from construction, consumer products, to textile and personal protective equipment, for example, just to give a few examples. But in addition to these, we also organize trainings and other events to raise awareness and to discuss standardization issues of relevance to SMEs at national and European level. Another important aspect is, of course, to ensure that the standards are developed are SME compatible. By developing and promoting tools such as, for example, the Sensenelec Guide 17, just mentioned by Deborah, and which I think is a very important tool, and also other tools that we have developed, such as the compatibility test. Deborah already mentioned that we participate also at political level in the governing bodies of Sen and Senelec. And let me finish by just mentioning that as part of our activities, we also follow up policies that have an influence on standardization. So just to finish this slide, SBS has as members both European and national associations representing crafts and SME. And these are both horizontal organizations and also organizations focusing more on a specific sector. Currently, we have 21 member associations representing approximately 12 million SMEs in Europe. So now let me go to the SME compatibility test. If Deborah can go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Which has been recently published just this week, a few days ago. And basically it's a test we have been working for a couple of years now. And the aim of the tool is basically to provide an overall perception of the SME compatibility of any standard. The test is based on and builds on the Sensenelec Guide 17 that was also just mentioned. And basically the intention with the test is to rank the standards into broad categories, broad groups, good standards, those that require little or no change, average standards, those which would benefit from change, and poor standards, those that really cause substantial challenges for SMEs and which require urgent improvement. So the assessment tool for us is the starting point for going more in depth into a specific standard and request possible improvements if the assessment shows that it is not very SME compatible. And it is important to mention that we have already tested the tool with some standards, but we also expect that with its further use, we will also gain more experience with the test, and we will also use this experience to update the tool if necessary. So the next slide, please, Deborah. Yes, so the test is intended to be applied by people with some experience on standardization and also on the subject area covered by the standard. And it can be applied at any stage of development of the standard. But of course, we also need to have a relatively stable text or draft to be able to apply it. So it can be applied, for example, on a draft for inquiry or for formal vote, or as well with published standards during the review process, for example, to try to identify areas which could be improved. We have developed an online version of the test so that it is more user-friendly and can help us also to collect information on the tests that have been performed. The test includes 11 criteria and 21 questions. I will go a bit more in detail regarding these criteria in a minute in the next slide. And these criteria questions include both criteria focusing more on the text of the standard itself and the way it is written, and criteria relating to the impact and implementation for the SMEs. At the end of the test, you get a score, which is calculated taking into account the replies to the different questions. And it is also important to point out that this is a general test. So the idea is that you can use it for all kinds of standards, but of course there might be some criteria that might not be relevant for a specific standard. So in that case, you can also, put as an answer that the criterion is not applicable. And yeah, just to mention that not all the criteria have also the same weight. So some have a bit higher weight. For example, some dealing with market access or the availability of guidance than other criteria. So in the next slide, I'm showing you what are the criteria that are included in the test. We don't have so much time, so I will try to just give you a hint and a brief description of each of the criterion. Each criterion is evaluated based on one or several questions, so you might have more than one question related to each of them. The first one looks at, which is called justification, target group, and relation with other standards, basically looks at drafting that might lead to possible misunderstandings or unclarity regarding the purpose of the standard, the target audience, or relation to other standards. This is important because for standard users and especially SMEs, it is important to get a clear and accurate information about the intended use of the standard, changes made to new editions of standards, and also the relation with other documents. The second criterion looks at the scope to see whether it is clear and unambiguous. Then we have another criterion, the third one, that has to do with normative references. This is an important criterion because normative reference to other documents when these are not needed, might make the standard unnecessarily complicated, and also, in addition, oblige SMEs to buy additional documents. Market access is another criterion, and this considers whether any requirements or defined performance levels, for example, in a standard, has the effect of forcing some products off the market or preventing current practices. In some cases, this can be justified because of safety or legal requirements, but in other cases, this could create unjustified barriers or that particularly might affect SMEs. This, for example, could be because the provisions of the standard, for example, a specific test method might, let's say, be detrimental to for SMEs, specifically to SMEs, for example. Relevance of content is another criterion, and this aspect is important because unnecessarily long standards might be more difficult to understand and discourage users from applying them. Perhaps one of the most important criteria of the assessment method is the one dealing with costs, requirements, and conformity assessment. It addresses the cost and difficulty associated with applying any standard, identifies whether requirements are imposed unnecessarily, whether assessment methods are reasonable, or whether the standard offers simplifying options. And it also looks at whether the standard respects the neutrality principle regarding conformity assessment and does not, for example, impose in one way or another third-party certification. Readability looks at whether the standard is understandable to qualified people who might not have been directly involved in the development of the standard. Then we have availability of guidance, which is also a very important criterion for SMEs. Technical committees can give guidance on how to apply a specific standard, either within the standard itself or in a separate document. As I said, this is particularly important for SMEs and for complicated standards, which cannot be simplified, or where there are substantial changes, for example, in content between two versions of the standard. And this aspect is important, as I said, for SMEs because they normally have less resources to get guidance or consultants, for example, to help them implement a standard. Then necessary modifications before applying the standard. This criterion covers adaptations which SMEs might have to make before applying a standard or any edition of an existing standard. And the main objective here is to assess whether there are unjustified or unreasonable burdens imposed by a standard as opposed to reasonable obligations. Then the next criterion considers the availability of elements external to the organization applying the standards, which are needed for its application, such as testing laboratories, for example, able to perform a specific test, a specific equipment, or other resources. And finally, the last one has to do with the transition period foreseen for the implementation of the standard and whether it is adequate. So this is, in brief, a summary of the criteria that are covered in the test. And after answering the different questions related to the criteria I just mentioned, you will get a percentage. And this percentage takes into account also the weight of the different criteria. And the lower the result, the less compatible the standard in relation to SME needs. As mentioned earlier, according to the results, we divide the standards on those that are poor and require urgent improvement, which are those with a result of 33% or lower, average standards, which should also be improved, and that are those between 34 and 65%, and good standards, those that require little or no change, which are those with a result of 67% or higher. So as I said, the test is available online. In the next slide here, you can see the link where you can access the test. And as I mentioned earlier, you are also welcome to give your feedback on the test by using on the email that is on the screen.
Thank you very much, Maitani. And I see that our audience is very keen on learning more. There's a couple of questions that we'll take in a moment. But first, since we're almost at the end of this webinar, we would like to take away, we would like you, sorry, to take away with you from this session a few key learning points. The first one is Senencenelic goal, which is to develop European standards and other technical specifications to respond to the needs of European industry, large and small, while meeting consumer, environmental, and other societal expectations. The second one, as Maitani reminded us, is that SMEs form the majority of European businesses, and it is therefore important that standard drafters and standards themselves take their needs and expectations into consideration. The third one is our key principle within Senelec system, which is the national delegation principle, key for an effective participation of all stakeholders in the European standardization system. Maitani, if you can take on from here.
So the next key learning point that I would like to highlight is that SBS, as an Annex 3 organization and having signed the partnership agreements with SEN and Senelec, have the right to participate in SEN and Senelec governance and also at technical level in technical committees. When writing standards, think small first is key. This also should help. This should help also to facilitate the uptake of standards among SMEs. The next point, which I highlighted and I would like to highlight again, is Senelec Guide 17, which provides guidance for writing standards taking into account the needs of SMEs. This is an important tool and guide that needs to be used when developing the standards. And finally, the SME compatibility test that is now available is another additional tool at your disposal to ensure standards are SME compatible. I can only encourage you to use it and share with us your experience with the tool as well.